In today's video, we're going to be building the Quad Plex. Starting to build the Quad Plex anyway. Welcome back to the office. Now, I'm wearing the exact same outfit in the exact same position as I was in the last video. That is not because I filmed it at the exact same time. Well, not at the exact same time, you know, just after it or just before it. That's not because I did that. I would never betray your trust like that. Have some faith in me. Alright, whatever, fair enough. I'm filming this directly after the last video. The reality is that the combination of last video and this video were going to be way too long. So I decided to cut it in half. That's the basic reason as to why there are two. But in this video, we're going to be finishing the skeletal portion of this enclosure, which the skeletal portion of this enclosure includes insulating it, putting the face boards on, and doing the basic lighting so that the reality of the lighting is more so that I can see what the hell I'm doing. I don't need to put the lighting in at this point, but it makes it a lot easier for me when I'm doing the backgrounds because I can actually see. I can't imagine those backgrounds would be that attractive if I'm basically working in the dark. So the step's a little bit backwards, but it makes my life a little bit easier. So we already know the system at this point as to what I'm about to do and how this video is going to go about. If you don't, that's because you're new. Welcome, it's great to have you. But unfortunately, the people that were here before you don't probably want me to go into that detail every single time. So if you want to kind of get a little bit more insight as to what the hell I'm doing, you're going to have to watch a previous video. Make sure to include a call to action. Alright, let's set play here. And the guy that's currently lifting that enclosure right there, which is obviously me in the past, a younger, more attractive version of myself, not as wise though, you can only imagine how much wiser I am now compared to this twat. He has still not come to terms with how heavy this thing is going to be. Bizarre, I know, because look at the size of it. Oh, you know, before we jump on here, I should probably explain what that is, because I didn't actually film that. The reason why I didn't film that was because I couldn't be bothered. Not going to lie to you, I simply couldn't be bothered to film it because it was frustrating me. But that section there where I've put like an extra shelf in, that's going to be where I house the electrical component for each enclosure, each timer for the enclosure, each thermostat for the enclosure. They're all going to be in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the fascia boards kind of set. I'll hopefully put up a photo of it finished so you can kind of see what I'm referring to. But on the side I'm going to have a door. And inside that door is going to be where all the electrics are, where the thermostats are, where the timers are. All of that stuff. So it doesn't have to be along the side, along the back, or along the top. It's hidden within the enclosure. So the only thing that comes out of this enclosure is a cable along the top for power. That is it. Everything else is enclosed. It just makes it a lot nicer, neater. I can push it closer to the wall, things like that. I didn't do it with Greta and Gabby's enclosure, and that was a mistake. Gizmo's enclosure does have it. I thought about that back then. All of his lighting is at the top of the enclosure, but I continued the enclosure above the top of where he has access to enclose it so it's not visible. So it makes it a lot more attractive. So for Gizmo's enclosure as well, there's only one cable coming down. But for Greta's enclosure, because currently only Greta is living in there, you know what? So if you all remember, this is Gizmo's enclosure. And we've got Gabby right here. She basically just lives in this enclosure with Gizmo now. These two get along marvelously. And there's little Gizmo at the back there. Well, I guess he's not so little when you compare him to her. So for the last 3 months, these two have basically just been permanently in with each other. They get along perfectly fine. They love each other. Well, as much as lizards can love each other. Gabby did lay 7 slugs at the end of last year. So I'm hopeful that this year, she won't give us slugs. She'll actually give us viable offspring. And to be completely honest, I don't know if I'll end up selling them. I'll probably just end up keeping them all. To be fair though, it would be a good idea to sell them, because what am I going to do with like 7 frilled lizards that are all related? You know what I'd probably do is sell them, and then I can put that money back into the channel to buy something else, because I'm not really into breeding. Like, my plan is to obviously breed things, but I don't want to make it a source of income that I'm dependent on. If things breed, fantastic, and I would like to have breeding pairs, but I don't want to get into like mass production or mass breeding. I don't want to go down that route. So if they breed, fantastic. If they don't, or if none of the eggs are ever viable, you know, it is what it is. I'm not going to be beating myself up, beating these two up. Although I don't think I could take both of them, they're quite tough looking. And the mist has just kicked in there, so we're going to leave them two alone. And here we are at Greta's enclosure. Now this enclosure we obviously built together, but I made a few mistakes when building this. When I built Gizmo's enclosure, I did a pretty good job of nothing really causing a problem. Even to this day, that enclosure's caused no problems, no leakage, no noise, nothing. No temperature issues, nothing. Apart from the fact that he damaged the background over time, there's been no issues with that enclosure. This enclosure, however, about a month after this enclosure being finished, it started to do this. You hear that? That's hella irritating, isn't it? And of course, her mister is now going as well. And here's Greta in her enclosure on her own with her big old chunky stomach there. Now, I've done some modification changes to her enclosure as well, as you can see. Mainly, I've got this box up here, which just has some cypress mulch in it. She very rarely goes in it. I've got this piece of plywood down here, which she never goes in either. But I gave her enclosure a bit of a change up because they just weren't using kind of the space, right? And they weren't using some of the decorations, and some of the branches were a little bit too skinny. So my plan here, and I'm hoping that it works out, is to breed Gizmo and Gabby together and then keep one of the babies, which is a male. And then I will be able to put that male in here with Greta. So here we are back in the snake room. So what I'm gonna show you now is what the purpose of that little divide is along the side, right? Along the side of the enclosure there, I built that addition. So right down here, this is what it is for. You see, we have a big power strip, which you can't see. We have a power strip along the back. Now that power strip runs up the entire of the enclosure, almost. And then it pops out the top. That way we can get the enclosure as far back as possible because we don't have any wires back there. So what we've got going on in here, each enclosure has its own thermostat controlling the temperature of the enclosure's hotspot. And in this enclosure, that's where our hotspot is, right at the bottom of that light. So there is our cable controlling the heat to this enclosure, and it's going to a thermostat. Now each one of these has its own thermostat. So this way I can house different species of animals with different requirements per enclosure, because each enclosure is capable of being maintained individually of the others. There is a minimum and a maximum that I'd want each enclosure to go to, because I don't want one enclosure to affect the one below it or above it. But this way all the enclosures can be independent of each other. So if one needs a few degrees more or a few degrees less, or way more humidity or way less humidity, I can manage that without it causing effect to any of the other animals in the other enclosures within this quadplex. So what else do we have in it? We also have the daylight, which is the switch back there, which is plugged in to a smart plug. But you see that blue light back there? That's saying that it's on, right? It's scheduled to be on. So each enclosure has its own setup like that. So if I needed to put a mister into this, I would be able to run it individually as well, and I can run it all through there. I don't have to worry about wires going in the enclosures. The enclosures can be as naturalistic as possible. Now, I did make a couple of mistakes when building this, which we will discuss later on in this series. My goal is to get all of the animals housed beautifully, and then I'll revisit some of the old ones where I made mistakes. But as you saw, I've already changed a lot of Greta's enclosure to make it a little bit more useful for her, because to be fair, there wasn't a lot of area for them to hide and things like that. She prefers it now, pretty much only sits on the rope. Occasionally she'll be on the cork bark, but pretty much isolated towards the rope now, which, as I said in the previous video, I was disappointed because she never used it. Now she doesn't get off of it. But anyway, we've discussed why I put those divides in there. Now let's continue watching. So what I'm doing now is insulating the enclosure. So each enclosure is going to have a background similar to that of Gizmo's and similar to that of Greta and Gabby's. Well, just Greta, because Gabby's not living in there anymore. But I want to put a base on it as a basic insulation layer. So this layer of insulation that's going on will not be carved. I will be putting on additional insulation, and that's what I will carve the background out of. This is just to insulate the enclosure, to keep the inside at a constant temperature more easily. So if there's a power cut or anything like that, because they are in the basement, right? The snake room is in the basement. It's easier for me to maintain the enclosure's temperatures with doing this system. So unlike Greta's enclosure, where I just did the background on the back wall there, I'm going to be doing this one as a full background. And I actually considered doing the roof or the ceiling of the enclosure for a little while. I decided against it. Can't remember the reason why I decided against it, but I did, obviously, because I know what the quadplex looks like, and I didn't do it. But similar to Gizmo and Gabby's enclosure, where it's the complete surrounds, I just think it looks a little bit nicer. It was a bit of a mistake doing Greta's enclosure the way I did, I should have done the full perimeter. But like I said, I'm going to be doing some modifications to Greta's enclosure in the future. For starters, building an extra portion so I can put all the electrical in it. Secondly, I want to completely eradicate those doors. So I want to put sliding doors on her enclosure, and I might even consider doing that for Gizmo and Gabby's enclosure. I haven't completely decided on that yet. But now the fun part begins. Well, I say the fun part. The part that absolutely sucks, but is also the most fun. The backgrounds themselves. Doing backgrounds is a love-hate relationship. It sucks, it's so much work, but it's really nice once it starts coming to the end, and how you can kind of brainstorm it just randomly when you're doing, making a coffee in the morning. You can kind of come up with, what if I do this, what if I do this, what if I do this? Or you can go online, look at some nature photos, and try and replicate it, which is what I did with one of these, and completely failed, and didn't do it again. But maybe you're more creative and more capable than I am. But as I said in last week's video, what I'm going to do here is, instead of doing what I did for Greta and Gabby and Gizmo's enclosure, which is do the background and then house them, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do each enclosure individually. So the next Quad Plex video that we post is going to be doing one of those enclosures from start to finish, the entire thing. Because we've got the basic structure now, right? This is a cabinet, right? This is the Quad Plex. Each one is an enclosure. I'm going to take it from background to decor to house to feed. That's what we're going to be doing as each one of those individual 4 videos. And then we will do a video at the end where I'm going over kind of the atmosphere of the enclosure, if it's done what I wanted it to do, and the finalized portions, because there's a lot that's going to have to go into this enclosure to make it work for these animals, right? You can't just build something like this and put animals in it. There's the temperature, there's the humidity, and there's trialing, right? Because when this enclosure was officially finished, I transported it to the snake room and then set it up for 4 weeks. No animal went in this enclosure for 4 weeks. And I also didn't transport it home until 2 weeks after it was finished, to let it fumigate, to let it completely dry and everything like that, before I put it in the snake room. The phone's going. Who is calling the company at 7:30 p.m. on a Sunday? And they don't even have the decency to leave a message. Where was I? You don't want to put an animal into an enclosure if the enclosure is not properly set up for them, because that's not going to work well for the animal in the long run. We want everything to be set up perfectly before that animal gets in there, which is henceforth why these videos take so long to produce, because I've got to build it, fumigate it, test it, house them, keep testing, and keep evaluating. Because I might put an animal in this enclosure and it just might not do well. So in that case, it can't live there, right? I have to move it. So you've got to do these trials to make sure everything runs smoothly. Now, the stuff that I'm using for the fascia of this is just PVC simulation wood, we could call it, right? It's got like a wood finish on the one side, so that's what I'm going to use at the front. I've used this on an enclosure before. It's an enclosure that we will not be discussing because unfortunately that enclosure now no longer exists. But it's PVC, so I can cork this to the melamine and it will be completely watertight. Now, what I'm using to apply it is contact adhesive. And let me tell you, when you get that stuff on your fingers, it doesn't come off. Not for days or weeks. So be cautious as to where you put your fingers once you have that glue on there, because they become hard, unlike other things. And now I'm installing the lights. And you see those circle portions of insulation there in the second enclosure, just above me, myself lying on the floor there? That right there is a maybe 2.5 inch hole that I've cored in the side of each enclosure for the cables to go through. I haven't shown you me doing it because there's no point. I think me explaining it there was probably enough. And we have lights. Each enclosure is now set up structurally, right? We have the skeleton done, we have the face boards done, we have the little shelf portion there. I'm not going to put the door on that little cubby hole section beside the enclosure. I'm not really sure how to explain what that is, but you know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to bother putting the door on it yet because I kind of need access to it. So it would just be a waste of time and be kind of inconvenient for me to do it during this portion of the build anyway. That's going to be in a later video. It's all ready for the next steps, and I will say that the next 4 Quad Plex videos that come out are a lot more entertaining than the last 2, because we're actually going to be getting, elbows deep in that enclosure. Literally, that's how far you've got to get to the back corners. And before I leave you here, you know what I'm going to do? is I'm going to tell you the animals that are going to be living in this enclosure. And then you, in the comments, can try and guess what those animals are. Some of you that have been watching along with the videos on the channel might already know, because I've featured some of them within the Quad Plex. But in the top enclosure is going to be Cleo. In the second top enclosure is going to be Hydra. The third top enclosure, or the second bottom enclosure, is Malagasy. And the fourth enclosure, the one at the very bottom, is Astro. Well, that's going to be it for this video. We've built the skeleton, we've built the faces, we've got the lights, we've got everything kind of set up now and ready for the next step. The next video is not going to be a Quad Plex production video. It's going to be something else.